Hello and welcome to this online talk about the early contacts between Egypt and the Mycenaean Greek world from around 1600 BC to 1200 BC. I will present some of my thoughts on the nature of these contacts, and I will do so by focusing on the four elements that you can see in this slide. I will be focusing on ships, on the role of ships in these contacts, on silver, on olives, and on the role of mercenaries in this context. My name is Jorrit Kelder. I work for the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and am also associate at the Oriental Institute at the University of Oxford. Thanks again for joining, and let's start with some bling. This, as most of you will probably know, is a golden death mask, and it was found by Schliemann in 1876 in one of the so-called shaft graves at Mycenae. The discovery of this object in many ways triggered the emergence of the academic discipline of Aegean archaeology, the study of the prehistoric Greek and pre-Greek world. But the Mask of Agamemnon, as it was quickly dubbed, also stands at the very beginning of Mycenaean civilization itself. Dated to about 1550 BC, the mask and numerous other precious objects that were found with it are a spectacular demonstration of the wealth and apparent power of the ruling elite at Mycenae. In the centuries following the deposition of the mask, Mycenae, which had hitherto been an insignificant village on the edge of the plain of Argos, steadily developed into a large settlement of more than 300 hectares. Until around 1400 BC, it was likely the dominant center of the Mycenaean world. The remarkable rise of this initially very unremarkable village, the astonishing wealth that was deposited in the tombs of its early leaders, and the even greater wealth its rulers must have acquired in later years — Homer refers to the city as Mycenae rich in gold — has intrigued archaeologists since the day of Schliemann. But despite over a century of scholarship, it remains unclear why it was precisely Mycenae that rose to such heights and how it managed to do so. In recent years, archaeologists seem to have focused their attention especially on social and political developments in Middle Bronze Age Greece in order to explain the sudden rise of the town. But in doing so, numerous potential external stimuli have largely been ignored. It is telling, I think, that the Festschrift for one of the field's most foremost specialists was titled Autochthon. In today's talk, I will try to rectify this tendency and focus my attention on early contacts between the Mycenaean world and especially Egypt. And I will propose that these contacts had a significant impact on Mycenaean society, and that the rise of Mycenae itself may in no small part be due to its capacity to control trade and diplomatic contact with especially the land of the pharaohs, with Egypt. Before I continue, I should probably flag 2 points. The first is that the Mycenaeans were not the first to establish more or less regular contacts with Egypt. We know that the Egyptians already knew of Minoan Crete from the 3rd millennium BC onwards. Crete is mentioned in various Egyptian texts as Kaftiu, and as I will discuss in a bit, it is likely that the first Mycenaean contacts with Egypt were established in the context of Minoan trading and diplomatic missions to the land of the Nile. And we see one of these trading missions here, on the walls of a tomb in Thebes in southern Egypt. The second point is that we are dealing with a period that is, to a very large extent, essentially prehistoric. From the Aegean side, we do know of a number of so-called Linear B texts, and from these essentially administrative notes, we can reasonably deduce that the Mycenaeans indeed knew of various other Near Eastern people, including the Egyptians. But the texts do not allow for much more than that. In Egypt, we do of course have a much larger and far more diverse corpus of texts, including numerous historical narratives. But the problem here is that very few of these texts mention the Aegean, and even fewer texts that refer to the Greek mainland, although 2 texts in particular are of interest, and I will come to that later. As a result, I will be mostly speaking about archaeology today. This has the great benefit that we can conjure up a lot from very few established facts. But it has the drawback that virtually everything that I'm going to say here can be disputed. So I am looking forward to your feedback later on. As I mentioned a minute ago, there are only very few textual indications for contacts between the Mycenaean world and Egypt. 2 Linear B texts, both from Knossos on Crete, mention an Egyptian, and interestingly, the words used are Miseraio, compared to Misr in Akkadian or even contemporary Arabic, or Aikupitio, which of course translates directly to Het Ptah, the house of the soul of Ptah, a designation for the city of Memphis, which was apparently already used as an ethnicon in the late Bronze Age. The date of the Linear B texts from Knossos is, like so many other things in prehistory, hotly debated, but it is safe to say that these texts must be later than 1400 BC. That the Egyptians had encountered Mycenaeans before that date is known from the so-called Annals of Thutmose III, a series of texts inscribed on the walls of the temple at Karnak, which relay and embellish the king's deeds. Thutmose is known to have been a particularly warlike ruler, and during one of his military campaigns in the Levant in his 42nd regnal year, approximately 1437 BC, he is reported to have received ambassadors from a land called Tanayu, who brought him a silver jug in Keftiu style, as well as 3 copper cups fitted with iron handles. As I've already mentioned, Keftiu was the Egyptian designation for Crete, and there is thus the suggestion that the visitors from Tanayu may have hailed from a similar northern direction. That Tanayu was indeed the Egyptian rendering for an Aegean territory is clear from a later Egyptian text, from the reign of Amenhotep III. So that's roughly the first half of the 14th century BC. You can see his feet on this picture here. Here, in this text, this land, Tanayu, is reported to have included various cities and regions on the Greek mainland, including Mycenae, Nafplion, and possibly the Thebaid, the region around Boeotian Thebes. The texts thus indicate that Mycenaeans had established formal diplomatic contact in the late 15th century BC. But what is most interesting is that on this very first recorded occasion, they seem to have already known how to behave properly on an international diplomatic occasion. The gift that the embassy from Tanayu brought to the Egyptian court is not a random collection of objects, but conformed to contemporary diplomatic customs and comprised objects of precious metals, most notably silver, which was widely used as an almost monetary standard. And the cool thing about this is that we may actually have some pictures to go with the text, because a number of tomb paintings that date to roughly the same time, the second half of the 15th century BC, appear to show Aegean messengers, some clearly Minoan, but others quite possibly Mycenaean, bringing precisely this type of stuff that is mentioned in the Annals of Thutmose III. And here I'll show that picture from the tomb of Rekhmire in Thebes in Egypt again, with a picture of those Minoan and possibly even some Mycenaean messengers bringing gifts to the Egyptian court. The fact that the first attested mission to Egypt conformed so well to established Near Eastern customs is, I think, significant, and it suggests a previous Mycenaean acquaintance with the Near East. There are some, admittedly very contentious, indications that Mycenaeans were already involved in international trade from the 16th century BC onwards, and perhaps even earlier. The first indication I suggest is the object that I showed you right at the start of this talk, the Mask of Agamemnon. The object is interesting for numerous reasons, including the suspiciously 19th century AD looking moustache, but mostly because of the fact that it is A, made out of solid gold, which is not found within the Aegean, and B, because the whole concept of a death mask is, to the best of my knowledge, alien to the Aegean. Both the concept and the material directly point to Egypt, which was known throughout the Bronze Age and indeed later times as the main and in many cases virtually sole supplier of gold. And these observations have, however, only very occasionally entered scholarly debate. And the acquisition of gold and the adoption of an Egyptian concept such as a death mask is usually explained as the work of Cretan middlemen, despite the fact that there is, to my knowledge, no indication whatsoever for similar death masks being known, let alone being made on, Minoan Crete. As I said before, the Mask of Agamemnon is dated to the 16th century BC, at which time Mycenae, though evidently already immensely wealthy, was just one of the emerging centers on the Greek mainland. And the question rises as to how Mycenae managed to acquire all the, presumably mostly Egyptian, gold that was found in the shaft graves. It's been estimated that we're talking about some 15 kilos in total of gold that was deposited there over the course of about a century. The answer is, I think, it has to do, with things such as the thing that you see here, a silver bull rhython, Popular and scholarly attention has traditionally focused on the gold from the shaft graves, but the amount of silver that was found in those very same tombs is almost equally stunning. Some 30 silver objects have been found in the graves, and most of them, such as this very Minoan-looking bullwrighten, were beautifully worked. Apart from the boom in the shaft graves, silver is remarkably scarce in the Mycenaean archaeological record, no doubt in part because of its tendency to disintegrate in chloride-rich soils, but there may be other reasons for this too, and I will come to that in a minute. Nonetheless, the precious metal was evidently known and worked by the Mycenaeans. There is one reference in the Linear B text to akuro, the syllabic rendering of arguros, silver, whereas a certain logogram that has not thus far been securely translated, but which occurs several times in the Linear B text, may equally have served as a designation for the metal. More importantly, silver could be found at several places within the Aegean world, and we know that the metal was mined on the Cyclades already during the Middle Bronze Age. On the Greek mainland, the silver veins of the Lavrion, just south of Athens, you can see it here on the map and on the right side, were probably mined in the same period. During the Mycenaean period, the Lavrion mines were certainly in use. We know this because in one of the mine shafts, archaeologists found Mycenaean pottery as well as some tools. Why is this important? Well, earlier I mentioned that silver served as an index of value, as a sort of money avant la lettre. From numerous contemporary cuneiform texts, we know that it was widely recognized as a standard that was used to estimate the value of diplomatic gifts, trade, salaries, tribute, ransoms, and fines throughout the Near East. Indeed, it has been suggested that silver may, in Egypt at least, have been of greater value than gold. And given its centrality to international diplomacy, to law and trade, the ready availability of silver in the Lavrion doubtlessly served as an important catalyst for the emergence of the Mycenaean world on the international scene, and the apparent Mycenaean ability to partake in diplomatic gift exchange, such as documented in the Annals of Thutmose III. Indeed, it may be more than just coincidence that a boat model, which was found in a tomb of the Egyptian queen Ahotep, who died in the 16th century BC, was made of silver and seems to portray an Aegean rather than Egyptian type of vessel. Silver in Egypt, it seems, may have carried some very Aegean connotations. Incidentally, it also seems likely that, precisely because of the importance of silver to late Bronze Age economies, silver, more than any other metal, was systematically removed from circulation, not only in the ancient Near East, but also in Mycenaean Greece, and this may explain the scarcity of the metal in the archaeological record. Whilst the silver reserves of the Lavrion just may have contributed to the rise of the Mycenaean world, there remains the question as to why it was precisely Mycenae and not a center closer to the silver mines, which rose to such prominence early in the late Bronze Age. To answer this question, we should have a look at what was going on in the wider region around Mycenae and the Lavrion in the 17th to 15th century BC. Although the results of chemical analysis of the silver from the shaft graves at Mycenae are not completely clear, initial tests seem to suggest that about 80% of the objects were made of Lavrion silver, but a more recent study by the same authors has brought this figure down to about 20%. It is reasonable to assume that at least a significant chunk of the silver from Mycenae originally came from this particular area. And I would imagine that the elites at Mycenae acquired this silver via trade, and not necessarily by conquest, at least not at this early 17th century stage. There is no indication that, at the time of the shaft graves, Mycenae controlled a larger area than its own immediate surroundings, and instead a scatter of relatively wealthy settlements around the Saronic Gulf, and especially at Colonna on the island of Aegina, seems to suggest that the various more or less independent communities of this region were closely connected through a trading network, which doubtlessly involved the exchange of local produce, such as wool, olives, olive oil, but also, and probably especially, silver. Colonna seems to have been an especially important node in this trading network, and its wealth and importance may be deduced not only from the fact that Aeginite pottery has been found throughout the region, or the monumental architecture at the site, but also and especially from things such as this, the so-called Aegina treasure. This collection of high-quality jewelry was found during clandestine digging on Aegina, and not only testifies to the wealth that was acquired, but the myriad of styles and provenances of the jewelry also attest to Egina's far-flung trading contacts, predominantly with Crete, but also to the Levant during the 17th century. The pair of earrings in particular resembles a gold pendant which was found at Tel el-Dabba, a site of the important harbour town of Avaris in the Egyptian Nile Delta. I won't dwell too long on the interesting role that Egina must have played as a wealthy trading centre during the 17th and 16th centuries BC, but on the whole I think I can reasonably suggest that Colonna on Egina was a focal point of regional trade around the Saronic Gulf, through which exotic goods, such as Minoan objects, but quite possibly also gold from Egypt, reached the wider Mycenaean world. Mycenae, I think, was initially just one of the many communities that was involved in this trading network. But the sheer wealth and overt Egyptian influence on the death masks in the shaft graves seemed to hint at something special that was happening there. I cannot, of course, state this with any certainty, and this must remain no more than a wild guess, but I would suggest that during the 16th century BC, Mycenae may have attempted to open up trade routes to the south, to Crete and beyond to Egypt, on its own, thus bypassing Egina. There is, in fact, some later evidence that seems to support the notion of some sort of a trade war between Colonna and Mycenae. I mentioned how Egina appears to have been a central hub of a Saronic-wide trading network. I also mentioned that during these centuries the landscape was dotted with various apparent independent, and if we may judge the size and architecture of some of these sites, quite wealthy settlements. And indeed some of these sites, such as Thorikos, the settlement overlooking the Lavrion mines, have been described as princely and may well have been ruled by fairly powerful local lords. In the 15th century BC, however, this picture changes rapidly and quite dramatically. At Thorikos, for example, the character of the site changes to such an extent that its excavator has suggested a takeover by a new dynasty, whose members were buried in remarkably Mycenaean-looking tholos tombs, beehive-shaped tombs like the one you see here. At the same time, Colonna on Egina seems to have met with a number of setbacks. No major building activity is attested at the site during the later 15th century BC, and the so-called mansion, a major building on the Acropolis, which likely served as the seat of the local ruler, appears to have gone out of use. By the early 14th century BC, a pottery kiln was built inside its ruins. At the same time, Mycenae appears to have been in the ascendancy. Mycenaean pottery is now found for the first time in significant quantities in regions where it had hitherto been extremely rare, most notably and tellingly on Egina, in Attica, in other words, near the Lavrion silver mines. And not much later, around 1400 BC, we have the first truly monumental palaces at Mycenae and its harbour town, Tiryns, which you see here with its impressive walls. All of this, I happily admit, remains speculative, and as I have noted before, we do not have historical text from the Mycenaean world that may corroborate or falsify these ideas. It may, however, be more than coincidence that precisely at the time when Mycenae seems to have established itself over the Saronic Gulf, that is around 1400 BC, the Mycenaean world becomes more visible outside the Aegean. I already mentioned the annals of Thutmose III, which date to approximately 1437 BC, and which demonstrate Mycenaean involvement in international diplomatic gift exchange. But equally interesting is a Hittite text, which dates to about 1400 BC and which mentioned military incursions in Cyprus and the Anatolian coast by a leader, he is labeled Lu, a man or king, of a hitherto unknown country called Achaea. Now this name will probably ring familiar, and it has been, conclusively in my view, identified as the Hittite rendering of the Greek Achaia, Greece. And even more interesting, the name of this Greek man is given. He is known as Atarisia, which is thought to either translate as Atreus, the mythical father of Agamemnon, or as the Atreid, a Homeric epitheton used for Atreus' sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus. I will not stray into the realms of legends today, but the bottom line is that as far as I can see, around 1400 BC, Mycenae appears to have controlled the Saronic Gulf and thus, by extension, not only the silver mines of the Lavrion, but also the trade routes to the south, to Crete and Egypt, and to the east, to Anatolia. The overall picture thus is one of rapid expansion, not only in terms of trade, but, in view of the overtly bellicose nature of Ataricia's exploits in Anatolia, clearly also military. This brings me back to Mycenae's relations with Egypt, and indeed to the title of my talk. I have argued that the need to secure access to the silver deposit in the Lavrion, which was required to open up and maintain contacts with Egypt, may have forced the rulers of early Mycenae to gradually expand their territorial control towards southern Attica, whilst the overseas silver trade with Egypt generated the wealth and prestige that was required for this and further expansion. So that accounts for the silver bit of the title. But contacts between Mycenae and Egypt did not only revolve around an Aegean silver for Egyptian gold trade. From the mid-14th century BC onwards, we have clear indications for far more diverse and intense relations between the two, which I hope to highlight in the remaining few minutes. In the introduction, I mentioned how we have very few Egyptian references to the Mycenaean world, and in fact we only have two, the Annals of Thutmose III and the so-called Hittite text, which you see here, from the reign of Amenhotep III, which lists a number of cities and regions that appear to have been part of Taniu. Taniu is mentioned in a few later Egyptian texts, but these are, as far as we can tell, essentially copies of this Hittite text, and they do not really add anything that is relevant for my argument today. That, however, does not mean that the Mycenaean world did not have any contact with Egypt after Amenhotep III. And quite the opposite, in fact, for it is precisely during the reign of Amenhotep's son and successor, the famous pharaoh Akhenaten, whose statue you see here, that the Mycenaean world really makes an entrance in Egypt. Akhenaten is, of course, famous for his reorganization of Egyptian religion and the foundation of a new capital city in Middle Egypt, Akhetaten, and I'll show you some beautiful reconstructions of that city here by the Amarna 3D project. The site of Akhetaten, which is now known as El Amarna, is of particular interest, because it was only briefly inhabited, deserted in the years following Akhetaten's death, and never really reoccupied, and as a result, objects revealed from the site can be fairly securely dated, and thus we know with certainty that at some point in the late 14th century BC, a large shipment of Mycenaean stirrup jars, which you see here on the left, probably about some 600 vessels, was delivered to the royal palace at Akhetaten. These 600 or so ceramic jars are of interest for a number of reasons. First, because of the sheer quantity of these vessels. We've already seen that there must have been occasional contact between Egypt and Mycenae before Amarna, but at Amarna itself, the Mycenaean world really makes its first imprint in the archaeological record of Egypt. Second, because of the context in which these vessels were found. You see a map here of the city. Most of the sherds were found in the central city, some in the domestic quarters on the north and south side of the city, but most in the central city, which is also the district where the palaces, ministries and main temples were situated. It thus stands to reason to assume that these spots were used by the city's elite. The Mycenaean corpus at Amarna is also of interest because it seems to have concerned only a single shipment and from a very specific place. Chemical analysis of the sherds indicates that virtually all of these vessels were made at a small settlement called Barbati, which is a stone's throw away from Mycenae itself. It thus seems unlikely that we are dealing here with a collection of vessels that were picked up along the way by some wandering merchant. Instead, it is reasonable to assume that these 600 pots and their contents were sent in bulk as a single shipment directly from Mycenae to the Egyptian court. One wonders why the court at Amarna would have wanted to import such fairly inconspicuous ceramic vessels. And the main reason for the Egyptian interest in these pots was, I think, because of what was in it. Now we know from contemporary Linear B texts that Mycenaean Greece, much like modern-day Greece, was a major producer of olive oil. Back in those days, however, olive oil was not only used for cooking, and the Linear B text mentioned various types of perfumed olive oil, which was presumably used as a sort of body wash avant la lettre, or perhaps as a type of scented fuel, compared to incense. In view of the vast amounts of olive oil recorded in the Linear B texts, it's likely that it was a major export product, and precisely the type of vessels that have been found at Amarna, flasks and the so-called stirrup jars that I've mentioned before, are known to have been used as containers for olive oil, We may then perhaps think of the Egyptian court importing precious perfumed Mycenaean olive oil, perhaps to add luster to court ceremonies, or in the city's great temple to Aten, the solar deity. There are some indications that olive oil and olives in general were indeed an item of particular interest to Akhenaten and his court. Although olive stones have occasionally, perhaps 2 or 3 times, been found in strata predating the Amarna era, the fruit was certainly exotic and extremely rare in Egypt. At Amarna, however, we have a real boom of olive-related stuff. An olive twig, which seems to suggest that the fruit was also harvested in Egypt, is shown in the hands of the king, you see it here, as an offering to the Aten on a relief that probably came from the temple at Amarna. Whereas we also encounter a large fresco of a complete olive tree in a house at Amarna. You see a picture of that here. The olive does not appear only for the first time in Egyptian art at Amarna, but there is an equally sudden boom of olives in the paleobotanical record. Olive stones were found in the village of the workmen who built the royal tombs at Amarna, and a wreath of olive twigs was found in a house in Amarna, and, perhaps more tellingly, 6 of such wreaths were also found on the coffin of Akhenaten's successor, King Tutankhamun. And you see a very small, sort of miniature wreath here on his inner coffin. What we have at Amarna then is 2 booms in the archaeological, botanical and iconographical record. One of Mycenaean pottery, which for the first time reaches Egypt in large quantities, and one of olive oil and olives, which is shown in close connection to royal activity and which is known to have been an imported product of the Mycenaean world. It is of course impossible to prove this in the absence of textual evidence, but I suggest that those 2 booms are related, and that it was an intensification of contact between Egypt and Mycenae that led to the import not only of olive oil and its associated use as an unguent, but also as the olive itself, which may have been planted along the banks of the Nile. I am slowly reaching the end of my talk now, and it is time to recap what I have argued today. We've seen how contact between the Mycenaean world and Egypt involved the exchange of prestige goods between the Egyptian and Mycenaean court, such as precious silver vessels in exchange for Egyptian gold, hence the silver in the title, and other exotica such as Greek olives and perfumed olive oil. So what about the mercenaries in today's title? Well, here you've got them. What we have here is a fragment of a unique papyrus which was found next to a Mycenaean stirrup jar in a little shrine in the central city of Akhenaten. And what you can just about make out are the contours of a fallen Egyptian who is surrounded by Libyan tribesmen. To his aid come a number of soldiers who, if we may judge their typically Egyptian kilts, are fighting on the Egyptian side. But these are not typically Egyptian soldiers. They are wearing leather body armor, which was highly uncommon in Egypt, and more tellingly, they are wearing a peculiar type of helmet made out of bands of boar tusks. What we have here is a typically Mycenaean military gear, and helmets such as these have been found in Greece itself, including this one, a spectacular one, including its corslet, at a village just south of Mycenae. The village is called Dendra. The papyrus from Amarna is unique, but we do in fact have some archaeological evidence for Mycenaean activity in the pharaonic military. At Pyramesse, an important royal residence in the eastern Nile Delta, German archaeologists have found a piece of boar tusk, complete with perforations that allowed it to be attached to a leather cap. And there is, of course, the much later testimony of Homer, who describes how the Greek hero Ulysses, Odysseus, in Greek, served the Egyptian pharaoh for some time before he continued his journey home. Homer is, of course, a very problematic source and cannot be used as evidence for Bronze Age reality. Nonetheless, there may be a kernel of truth to his stories, and that leads me to the last slide of today, a wooden ship model which was found in a 12th century tomb at the site of Gurop, not far from modern Cairo. And in a recent and important study, Shelley Waxman has, in my view persuasively, argued that what we have got here is a model of a pentaconter, the typically Greek warship that would dominate the Mediterranean during the Classical era. Even more interesting is the fact that its model is painted, not only in black, to designate the tar that made the hull watertight, but also with red stripes along the front, along the sides of the vessel. exactly like the ship of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey. Mycenaean contacts with Egypt, in sum, appear to have been of a very diverse nature. We are dealing with trade, diplomatic gift exchange, but we are also talking about the movement of people and Egyptian recruitment of Mycenaean mercenaries. All of this, by the way, is very similar to later, far better documented contacts between Greece and Egypt, when we have the same types of exchange, trade, and the hiring of Greek mercenaries. But apart from all these material expressions of Greco-Egyptian contacts, we should perhaps also think of more immaterial things, such as the exchange of knowledge and religious ideas. In sum, I think today's paper is best summarized by the Greek-Egyptian poet Kavafis, who very appropriately in his poem Ulysses already stated that in many ways the voyage is more important than the destination, and by traveling far and wide one can learn a lot. May you visit many Egyptian cities and learn again. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this small presentation. Thank you.